So today's focus is to identify the elements of this framework that is fostering this energy transition and an urban sustainable mobility. We want to identify the obstacles that are making prices to raise or the obstacle for consumers to be lacking confidence. This is the goal of this panel. I want to identify now, or I want to introduce the speakers. We have four of them. We have Fernando Calancha, who is an estate lawyer. And a partner of Department for Regulatory Administrative Law, or PwC. We also have here with us José López Tafal, the Director General of ANFAC, who has a prominent role in the Spanish world in wind energy. We have also here with us Juan Diego Casal, CEO of Edinor, a company created by Petronor to promote the energy transition and sustainable mobility. And then we have Mónica Díaz, technique in the area of energy efficiency in industry and transport of the Basque Energy Agency. So I would like to explain how we're going to organize this panel. I'm going to ask each of them an introduction of about 5 minutes to talk a little bit about what they do and the most important project they are working on at the moment, so that they can tell us what they are seeing currently from the framework regulatory perspective. Then secondly, we have a question round with 4 of them. They will have the chance to ask and answer their own questions and to create a discussion. I would like to be a discussion. And finally, we will open the questions for the audience and for the people who are following us on the internet. And I will finally ask them a question myself. So I'm going to give the floor to Fernando so that he can introduce us who he is. Thank you very much. This is a pleasure being here with you and sharing this panel. I would like to start with something very practical. The price of energy at the moment. Right now, from 10 to 11, this time lapse is 300 euros megawatts an hour. France is 300, Italy is 327, among others. These prices are exaggerated. We have never seen such high prices so far. Everybody is in this discussion because the price of gas is international, and this reveals the scarcity of the energy. It is difficult to adopt international policies to modify this, and the price of gas has increased 4 times since the month of January of this year. The cost for emission has multiplied by 3. It's a market that it's intervened. It's in charge of the European Commission. So it's a marginalist market, which means that the last unit that is fixed for all installation, the last unit is normally a combined cycle or a fuel fossil. It has increased the global consumption, and it has also made prices to increase. And it's not a Spanish phenomenon, but it's a European one, and it doesn't have to do with culture. We need to analyze the causes, but We don't know when it's going to be over. And it's a phenomenon that can generate not only important discussions, but it can generate competitiveness in economy, in the industry. I believe it's not exaggerated if we talk about energy crisis. I think it would be exaggerated to talk about discussing the basic principles for which this energy is bouncing. This year, going back to the month of February or March, we had the same worry as the past years because this is a fact. It's a scientific and accepted fact. IPCC. IPCC is the organism linked to the European Union and the most serious report when it comes to climate materials, that if we didn't keep doing the same, the temperature of Earth will be 5 degrees higher. And we adopted those policies, the needed policies, that raise will be only 1.5 degrees. So whether we want it or not, we are facing a climate change. So new scenarios were being established on how to balance this climate change. And when it came to mobility, also very important goals were set. So what happened in Europe? Europe has taken a long time to have a solid regulatory framework because the Commission is awarded an homogenizing role, and thanks to that role of making the decision making and the need for decarbonization, and the news is that it doesn't only restrict to one sector but also to others, such as the mobility sector. With all this, I mean that in moments of doubt, we need to hold the most solid principles. And within those basic solid principles, I think the energy transition needs to keep its own steps, because we can't deny the renewable energies play a major role, and we don't have to make decisions that will damage that transition. So the role of electrification in economy is also an indisputable process. In Europe, it has an homogenizing role, but there is no other different means. We come from a finance politics, and that is not possible at a European level, and neither at a global level, and which is the case in China and in the US. I just wanted to highlight that in such an important moment, we should not forget the principles that have led us to this point, and the regulatory frame plays a major role in this situation and in the climate change. This is a norm that provides for this process to be more dynamic. But there are still distortions internationally. Well, I've been unfair with you because you have such a heavy topic that giving you 5 minutes is impossible. But you did a great job, and I'm going to give the floor to Jose. I'm not going to ask you a question. I'm going to let you speak about what you find most important. Thank you very much, David. and the City Council, Petronor, and the organizers for inviting me. As FAC is the National Association of Automobile and Truck. We represent a sector of the automobile which is relevant for the Spanish economy because it's the first product of our commercial scale. And for the positive budget of 14,000 million euros. So about 2 million people live of the sector of automobile, not only the producers, but you can find adverts of automobiles in any corner of the city. So from the person who is sticking that advert to all the people who work in the automobile sector, this is a huge field. It's a passive and active stakeholder of the energy transition. It's an element that is decarbonization. We will have an evolution of the technology, but the phenomenon of the climate change and the need to take action in Europe, I think it's one of the most active people in this process. And therefore, a whole regulatory framework is generated that is fostering the transition linked to the automobile sector. In this 2020 decade, the process of decarbonization is fundamentally on the transport sector, mostly on ground transportation, because we believe that the low emission technology has reached a point that could be similar to the renewable energy. So we are about to get very important technologies that are going to help us reduce more emissions. So how relevant is that for us? As I have mentioned, I like remembering that we are the second automobile producer in Europe. And when regulatory pressure is applied, because this is generating changes in industry, that means a technological challenge, a climate challenge, but also a social challenge, as well as economical and industrial. And those are the three great challenges that we see, but other countries do not. So that is why we need to be intelligent enough to design a decarbonizing policy that ends reinforcing the Spanish automobile industry. Which one is our challenge? That is published in our web, where you can see the scenario towards the automobile sector is heading. And it's moving between two topics: the change for digitalization, which is going to enable us to make changes in urban mobility, and changes for decarbonization, where a regulatory pressure is going to be applied. We need to make the future mobility electrical, connected, shared, and probably autonomous. Those are the elements from the point of view of the offer. But we also need to make it comfortable, accessible, and safe. So we need to take the perspective of the consumer, not only from the regulator of the offers. So that's where all the technological decarbonization changes, among others, take their place, together with the demand of the consumer. It's a scenario where our proposal is a constructive one. We're following the 2040 horizon for zero emissions. So we believe that can generate value in our income with a raise of 50%. But we mean that we are able to do this, we are willing to do it. So in all these processes during 20 years, we have needed to establish a regulatory framework and to forget about the what, because we all share that, and to focus on how to regulate, how to do it in an efficient way, how to fulfill the goals, how to make better, how to reach better results with a minimum effort. And this will be a huge topic, but that is the framework. So I always like saying that if there is anything lacking, it's not cars, because you go to any car dealer and you can find an electric one with a hybrid battery or whatever you want. There is not a problem. There is not a problem of offer. There are many other problems, but the offer is not the problem, and we are going on a good way. So this is different regarding your question. Is the air energy is easier? Well, I don't know now. Maybe not right now. All right, Juan. I'm sorry. What I wanted to know is other than Edinor and what do you do, but the role of the city council when supporting what they are doing. Well, Edinor, very briefly, we are a joint venture with the group Petronor, which needs to carry on a decarbonization process. So we want to become an active agent of decarbonization in this country. So for that, we have started this project on energy transition with biofuels, biosustainability, and the distributed energy. That is what we are working on in Edinor at the moment. Then, as you mentioned, we are very focused on the local field. We would like to analyze the regulatory frame and to see whether the city councils are taking an active role in this transition. The new energetic market in Europe must be characterized by the famous 3Ds: decarbonization, decentralization with renewable energies, and democratization. What do we mean with that? That there has to be a citizen participation for such a big transformation as it is the energy transition. In fact, the European Commission states that the energy transition is carried on by the market and the technology, but without the participation of the citizens, there will not be such process. So there are two Ds, the decentralization and democratization, that places city councils on the central point of the process. There has never been such a powerful proposal for city councils in order for them to play a very significant role. That is what we wanted to highlight. Among other alternatives, one of them is to foster the local energetic communities. And the city councils have a role to play because those communities are being generated, are becoming consistent. But if they see that the city council is supporting them, they will be more confident. So there are several ways to promote these processes, but one of them is to take advantage the covers of municipal buildings to generate an installation that is going to be owned by a community. So they can make the investment, they can have a shared consumption, And this figure of energetic communities is very spread. There are more than 3,000. In this community, there are up to 400,000 people. And first of all, it is fundamental for the citizens' awareness on sustainable energies, also for energy mobility, to generate autonomy and a social awareness, and the role we all need to take in this process. All this is basic, that dynamic within a town can build several things. So I'm just going to mention the problem is that with this regulatory framework, if a city council poses the question to take advantage of these municipal buildings covers to use them one way or another, and given the situation at the moment, the city councils that take this step to take advantage of this to generate something in a community, they are pioneers because it makes everything else more simple. So in that state of regulation, the problem is that with the opportunity that city councils have to take that role, if they do too little, we're talking about decarbonization and decentralization, democratization, but they will be missing the third D. Or can you explain a little further, but maybe later? Yes, thank you. Monica, could you please explain what the LT of energy is in the Basque Country, what you are doing referring sustainable urban mobility? Yes. I had a script for these first 5 minutes, but I'm going to improvise a little bit. Personally, I'd like to mention that I'm happy to be here without a mask. I'm about to cry. This past weekend, Bilbao Petronor took place, and we broke the record of participants. It's good to congratulate ourselves. I'm happy to be here physically sharing this space with people who are collaborators. In March, for example, we will take part in another fair by mobile which will take place in Irún, Guipúzcoa, to share the abilities that the Basque industry has at the moment. And therefore, as a person, I would like to say that I'm very happy, although a little restless than normal, because it has been a long time since I last stepped on a stage. I'm going to introduce Deble, because you will see that I will tend to talk about the Basque Country and about the mobility. So for those who don't know us, is an energy agency of the Basque government. It was created in 1982, and one of our functions is to define the energy strategy in the Basque Country. It's currently the 3E 2030 strategy is going on, and under that umbrella, we have other strategies or even laws that we will discuss later. For example, the law for energy sustainability in the Basque Country, or the strategies for the electric vehicle. And to talk about what we do in the field of regulation, we need to highlight that we have research and energy plans to try to control the policies and the strategies for energy regulation, and in order to identify the challenges and the opportunities and to suggest improvements. And to keep describing what we do, I would like to take advantage of the title of this panel, which is Regulating Frameworks for Energy Transition. I'm going to start with energy transition. Well, this is improvised, as you can see. I would like to fuel this discussion. We all know, that the energy transition, and we all know where it's leading us. That all word we should emphasize, because we are the people working in the field of energy. We are talking about the price of electricity, but if we go out to the streets, people probably don't know what the free market or the regulated market is. If we ask the public, probably here or through the screen, if they knew whether they had a electric contract of one way or another one, they will probably doubt about it. That is why it's very important to make citizens to convey this information so that they can participate in the process. But we will need to educate and train them in an objective way as far as possible. So we all working in this world, we know that this energy transition will lead us to a sustainable development. I'm not sure when this journey started. In the 82, when EBE was created, we were already in a process of energy transition. We were trying to make emphasis on other type of fuels other than coal. I've been working in this company for 15 years, and we're still talking about evolution. So what has changed? So it's probably the worries that we have. For example, the climate change, but although this is not news, but we are very aware of citizens' health, of how dependent we are on other countries for oil, for the geopolitical controversy. But we all have it very clear that where this is leading us. It started a few decades ago. The problems can be a little different, but this train is taking us to a final destination, which is a 100% renewable energy world. And we all have this very clear, and this is what we're working on. And from our company, we're working from regulation towards the energy transition, because we support with our knowledge all those proposals for the improvement, all those energy strategies in the Basque Country in order to create laws that will help us fulfill our goals. So as the summary of this first intervention, I would like to say that the regulating frameworks can be a very useful tool if we use them correctly, because they affect not only citizens but also to the results of figures of many companies. But the regulation is also a chance for change and a chance to at least try to make things better.
This is a perfect moment to ask you the first question. The government's decision on 14 September on the price of electricity, but now the question is, does this type of intervention, is it welcome? Is it having an impact, an effect on the trust, on the legal stability? What effect can this have on investment? Well, I'd like to link this to what Monica said. I agree with her in that we need to take a significant step so the energy transition can reach citizens and consumers. What has arrived is the perception of climate change. We all see this. Every year we see that things are changing and will change further. And also linked to Juan Diego's intervention, it's very clear that, for example, an energy community which has as the core the consumer, or physically the city council, but they're not taking all the necessary steps so that it can become a reality. We have a framework that's good enough to make everything happen more dynamic and put the consumer at the center, both for the energy transition and in institutions which is establish, for example, energy communities. And now to answer your question, what I think is very debatable is that within that framework that we've given ourselves, we have to explore it in more depth and remove all barriers to take isolated decisions without the consensus of the Spanish public powers, without having consulted the European Commission or the countries that can do this. We have a domestic market where one's decisions not only affect other countries, but other economic agents. What decisions has the government taken? Right now, there's a project, draft law, to internalize the CO2 emissions in offers, and they distinguish between those that have emissions, those that don't. What the emission rights seeks is for those who truly emit to pay and not take advantage of that circumstance. Urgently, for 6 months, they've approved a measure which aims to reduce the price in the electricity market. There's a rejection of taxes, and this is all collected to reduce part of those loads. I think the only people interested in all the legal aspects of this is me here, so I'll leave that to one side. But I think that the need to coordinate with Europe is very necessary, and more so when there are distorting effects. Those who regulate make mistakes, that's a premise, and those who regulate with urgency make even more mistakes. And when you touch the markets, you have to do it with a lot of care so you don't create these distortions. So what's happening? There are renewable installations that aren't operating as a result of this measure, even encouraging the possibility of energy coming from other countries. The impact this has on PPAs, which are long-term contracts for purchasing energy is usually renewable, is enormous, because these contracts, which are bilateral and which they trusted in for the development of renewables without support, but just with the knowledge of these have been cast into doubt. The rating agencies say that this creates instability. Someone with a 15-year PPA to establish a fixed price for those 15 years, if they see that a government decision affects them, it will affect some, not others, but it could have affected them. That feeling of insecurity is huge. One of the virtues of the regulatory framework we have is that everyone is aware of the need for stability that investments need. And maybe those isolated decisions should focus more on further exploring the aspects that need for the energy market, and instead of generating these differences. Jose, Fit for 55 framework isn't in legislation yet, but it's been drafted in the EU, has the goal of getting rid of new combustion engine vehicles by 2035. How do you see this from the ANFAC's perspective? Is it feasible? Is it not? What needs to be done to achieve this goal? Well, the EU Commission's proposal from July is an increase in the pace of decarbonization. It was set a couple of years ago, the European Green Deal. I don't think it's a paradox, but regardless of the figures, we need to set the need for strategic legal framework so that industry can make investments that sometimes last a decade and so on. But then 2 years ago, what was revolutionary becomes obsolete, and we have to go even further. So in 2 years' time, the same thing can happen. Well, just as a reflection on how this is regulated, at least at a minimum, you could say that at that time, 2 years ago, someone was suffered a lack of forward planning. So regardless of that, the automotive industry is at the center of the Fit for 55. Why? Because it's at the center of decarbonization, which is the foundation of Fit for 55. It proposes an increase in the pace. And what does the automotive sector in Spain say? Right now, we'll see in Europe in a minute, the scenario for the automotive sector is here, which sets the climate and energy planning in 10 years where we want to be in 2030. And the climate change law, which at last we managed to get approved this year, which says that by 2040, that's the limit for decarbonization. Well, none of them are any good for Fit 55. We'll have to revise them again. What it means is the number of electric vehicles in Spain by 2030 has to increase by times 35. And according to our estimates, the number of chargers has to multiply by 30. So that's why I insist, well, can we move on to our new targets? Well, it depends. It depends on how the instruments we have are regulated. I like a sentence that you say, where they say, put your money where your mouth is. I think that's fantastic. It's all well and good to set objectives, but as a sector, we're saying we prefer to look at the tools. If you give me the tools, I can do it and we can talk about it. If you just give me the objectives and don't give me the tools, it's going to be very difficult. So that's why the automotive sector in Spain and Europe is saying, we're not refusing to discuss it. We're not refusing to accept these additional goals, but these or others have to be feasible goals. So it's essential that you put on the table all the tools that you say are the necessary tools to meet those goals. So therefore, any modification of the goals also has to entail a revision clause to verify whether what we're doing, what we said we would to achieve those goals, or it turns out that we're not, and we have to revise them. I'll give you an example. This is a part of Fit for 55. This plan means an increase in the goals for the automotive sector to reduce emissions in new vehicles. Now 37.5% of vehicles, it has to be 50 to 55%, and by 2035 to make it 100%. If you don't meet this, you'll be fined. It's not that they fine you for not having produced, for not having invested. They fine you for having registered cars. They fine you because maybe you decide they don't want to buy them. And they fine the person selling the product, not the one who buys it. Great, that's a tool that's there. We know about it. Okay, and now they say to do that, it's important. We need to implement Fit for 55. We have to change the energy tax. We have to raise taxes on hydrocarbons. Okay, we need vocational training programs. We need to create a stability fund for reforms so that the impact on the most disadvantaged social classes is compensated. And we have to set up regulations that establish binding national goals for the deployment of charging infrastructure for electricity and hydrogen on roads and public spaces. Okay. The only sure thing about this is the fine if I don't meet my goals. The Energy Tax Directive. So it's all very well to write it down, but I have a friend in Galicia who says that if I say the donkey's this color, it's because I've got the hairs in my hand. Well, it's just a joke. I need the tools. If the directive is instrumental to achieve a set of goals, I'm not regulating properly. So goals, no problem. Can they be met? They could be met, provided the set of tools that the EU Commission says that will be launched are really actually there. We have to multiply by 30 the charging objectives. The EU Commission says, no, that's not enough. You have to multiply them by more. It will be compulsory binding. So when we change the regulations and we see that the charging points are being installed and that in Spain that regulation has been adapted, that it's in the local regulations, regional regulations, safety regulations, energy, etc., well, then you can say, okay, we're on the right path, but otherwise we have a problem. It's going to be very difficult. So that's a regulatory framework. I was going to say that the difference between the ANFAC's perspective 4 years ago and today is radical, because before it didn't have the same feeling that ANFAC was in favor of doing this. What you're saying is that we're there, but we need a framework that helps us. What I'm saying is that we're the oxen and we're pulling the cart. Well, but I'm saying that it seems more positive than 4 years ago. We're starting to talk a bit about some of the barriers, municipal barriers, but I didn't understand what they are. Could you help me understand how town councils are having problems helping with the creation of energy communities? Well, I'll try. Sometimes regulation is necessary for things to happen, but in this case of energy communities, things are happening without regulation, because in a market like this, like the electricity market, it has its risks. In fact, if now we create energy communities in Google, we'll start to see initiatives all over the autonomous communities. The other day I was at an event organized by the ministry, and the Valencian government announced that by 2025 they want to have an energy community in each municipality in Valencia. And you say, what is this? And they're not regulated anywhere. They're regulated in European directives, but Spain has not transferred those directives to its own regulation. According to European directives, they have very specific characteristics. They have to have a legal personality. It could be a cooperative, an association, a limited company. They have to be integrated by people, small retailers, or municipal entities or SMEs. So the vocation is that we don't have big companies participating, big companies who have a role in the energy market. The next condition is that they have to, the people participating in energy community have to be close to an installation, a renewable installation supplying them. Another important thing is that, of course, they have to have an economic activity, but this doesn't seek profit, but to generate benefits, environmental, economic, and social benefits for the surrounding area. So the features announced in European directives are quite clear, but that hasn't been transferred. So what happens? When you go to a town council and you say, well, we have the chance with these municipal buildings where we can transfer them to an energy community. And the first thing they say, the municipal technicians say, well, what's this thing about energy communities? When you can't follow a regulation that gives them a role in the market with rights, obligation, set of features, with a registration that can be acknowledged, then people start being afraid. They say, what are we getting ourselves into? So that's one thing. And the other, which is very important, is that in the end, those participating in energy communities are small retailers, private citizens. People want to be committed when the energy transition, but not at any price. The first question asked, and we've been with many people and small retailers, and they ask, well, what do I save with this? Where's the saving in this? How does this benefit me? Because if I won't see any savings, I'm not going to get into an energy community with everything it entails. So now, right now, with our regulations, the biggest benefit it has is that if the installation within a radius of 500 meters, it's considered shared self-consumption. You don't pay any additional taxes. So the energy generated is quite cheap. But what happens? But due to the regulation, there is shared self-consumption is limited to 100 kilowatt installations at a 500 meter radius. So this for town councils is madness. Particularly the thing about the 500 meters, because in a small town council you can say, well, I have an installation in a sports center or whatever, I can cover the whole municipality. But in a large council like Bilbao, if I install it on a building, how do I justify to my population that those within a radius of 500 meters will benefit from it and those who are 600 meters away won't? So we've even had the paradox where a town council here in Vizcaya, we've met with the mayor, we identified the buildings, we looked at the 500-meter radius and said, hey, my house is outside this, I'm at 550 meters away. And there's no technical reason for that. So the solution is to say, well, instead of building, we can do it with 2 or 3 buildings and try to complete the whole municipality so that at least all the citizens and retailers have the chance to participate. But those 2, then there's more. But the legal figure, which isn't identified, and from the economic point of view, the 500-meter limit and 100 kilowatts, these are 2 big obstacles. Later on, I'd like to know if a large energy company can't participate, what are you doing in this business? That's the next question. So, Monica, I understand that there's a law on sustainability in the Basque Country, and you're going to explain a bit about what it's about. How does it affect sustainable mobility? Well, a bit like I said before, we mentioned the word decarbonization of transport. To arrive at that law, which is quite broader than just, so to speak, mobility or transport. Why do we need the decarbonization of transport? Why do you talk so much about transport? And it's very trendy lately, when a few years ago the main protagonist was industry. We're looking for energy efficiency in industry, but now everybody's talking about transport. The reason is that, well, transport has become the first consumer of final energy. It's overcome the industrial sector, so that's where we have to make changes. 95% of energy consumed comes from oil derivatives, because of everything we've said, concern about climate change and so on. Well, this has to change. And I like to say something, which is that transport or mobility, to change things, we have to move. This is linked to what Jose said, that, yeah, regulation is all fine. We have to accompany it by tools and so on. I totally agree. Something that came to mind when you said that was that a few years ago, time flies, my God, at a conference I asked, there were representatives from car brands, and I asked, do car dealerships have electric vehicle sales targets specifically? Because we know they have commitments with brands, etc. And at the time they said no. They were quite squeezed already to have targets specifically for electric vehicles, as things were in this period. And now they do. Now the time has come. And that's thanks to or because of the regulation. So to change things, we have to move. I entirely agree that we have to accompany it by tools. But if we don't squeeze a bit here and a bit there, we'd still be in our comfort zone, which is what we're used to, and the momentum we don't like to leave. But as for the law on sustainability you asked about, it's the law on energy sustainability in the Basque Country, which is a continuation of a previous decree. And this law affects, in particular, the Basque administration, though it's also true that it has some obligations for the private sector. I'll focus a bit on those of the administration, because the primary goal of this law is to try to get the Basque administration to be an example. Try to give an example for the rest of the sectors, even citizens. If we want things to be done in a certain way, we have to start by doing it ourselves. So one of the goals, to not mention all of them, I don't like to get tangled in numbers, but one of the goals is that by the year 2030, the Basque administration will have had to reduce its energy consumption by 35%. Well, that's there. We don't know if we will meet that. We might be at 34%, or we might even get 40%. But our path has been set where we have to go. And to do this, we have to prepare an inventory of the fleet, of buildings, we have to prepare energy action plans. So we're forcing ourselves to sit down and plan things, which is very important because on a day-to-day basis, we don't sit down to think, look at the path we want to follow. In the field of transport, well, there have to be energy audits, etc. And now focusing on transport, I think the fact since 1st of January 2020, the Basque administration, when I say the Basque administration, I mean all the Basque government's departments, the provincial governments, all the town councils, and the companies and agencies who are attached or in some way depend on the Basque government and the provincial governments. Well, look, they have to purchase from 1st of January 2020, the renewal of the car fleet, they have to be alternative fuel vehicles. You can't imagine the number of questions that we receive because of this, due to a lack of knowledge very often. For the simple fact of not knowing whether a hybrid vehicle that isn't plugged in is considered electric or not. Well, those of us in this sector all day talking about electric cars here and that, well, we have a clear idea, but those who are dedicated to other things apart from purchasing cars, well, they don't really know. They have to prepare sustainable urban planning, mobility plans. Companies who have more than 100 workers have to prepare transport plans. Again, we're inviting them to sit down and think, to carry out a diagnosis. We also encourage the use of cycling, the installation of charging points at workplaces or in urban environments. So, well, we're trying to channel certain obligations. It's a bit of a harsh word, but we do try to provide an example. I'd like to leave that conclusion about the law on energy sustainability, and that's it. It's trying to give an example to achieve the goals in the rest of the sectors. Well, in principle, we have 2 rounds of questions. I don't know how much time we have left. Is there anyone who can tell us? About 10 minutes? So I think we have to start by asking whether anyone has any question here in the room for the speakers. There's 1 or 2. Good morning. I'm John Leque, president of the Association of Car Retailers. First of all, in Vizcaya, sorry. In fact, I hadn't met Jose, but I represent this association in the Basque country. I talk to Gerardo every day, which is who you talk to. Well, initially, I wanted to say yesterday I had a presentation, and today I didn't. Like in recent years, I thought that we were always focusing on energy transition and regulations, but only for electric vehicles. As I say, the energy transition is equally valid for other alternative energies, such as has been said, hydrogen, biogas, or eco-fuels. As we always say, what's important is achieving net emissions of CO2. If we use 100% electric vehicles in a country like Spain, where less than half of electricity production is renewable, the vehicle doesn't have direct emissions, but to charge itself, it has had emissions. So, based on Monica's comment, she knows me very well, I'd like to just point something out. Of course, to lead to such a big change, there has to be some regulation. But the example of the car retailers, car dealerships, as I experienced this personally, it's one thing to have regulation, and it's a different matter to regulate too harshly at different speeds. If you can go too fast in a vehicle, it isn't adequate, you can kill yourself. Well, this is the same thing. The reality is that in Spain today, the most sold vehicles have an average price of 12,000 euros, and the electric vehicle is above the average price and the average income in Spain. It's not the same to regulate. It's not the same to have a regulation that's very forced for electric vehicle with fines for manufacturers depending on average emission. It's not the same to do it in Norway or in Northern European countries which have a much higher average income than in Spain. What has been the reality? I was taking Monica's example in car dealerships. We end up registering in Spain many electrical vehicles so that the manufacturers can reach those emissions goals. But the reality is that very low share of electric vehicles are registered to car dealerships and not to citizens. So these measures should be thinking about the citizen. And as I always say, the whole automotive sector, both manufacturers, dealerships, distributors, were all aligned for decarbonization for many years because it's one of the industries that has most evolved in this field, more than in other fields. But it's one thing to evolve and it's another to accelerate too fast. And I know that many of the problems are derived from Europe. But Monica's example is good because we suffered this in person last year. Car dealerships, they registered most of those cars instead of citizens. And this isn't natural. It's more of a statement than a question, but maybe some of you might like to answer. Yes, I'd like to say that I totally agree with Jon in that the electric vehicle in the environment where it operates, I usually explain to my children, well, if it doesn't have an exhaust pipe, it doesn't have any fumes. But if you're charging it with electricity that comes from a coal plant, well, you're moving the problem elsewhere. So that's why we're working together on different pillars. And we were saying this journey, well, we want it to end at 100% renewable energy generation. If we can achieve this, the electrical vehicle would be the ideal solution. If we can't do it, well, we're failing. And we're also talking about price. It's true. When you go to the car dealership, if you don't have more information about the useful lifetime of the vehicle, well, it's true. It's more expensive. That's why we have to... We're going back to the start of this session. We have to inform people with objective information for companies, for town councils, for those who are going to buy a car. First, it has to cover your mobility needs. The autonomy is the range is increasing. What about the price? Well, yes, there's this widespread trend of believing that the electric car is more expensive than the combustion engine vehicle, but then its useful lifetime, as you use it, well, the use is cheaper. But today, who carries out a calculation of this, the cost over the lifetime of the vehicle? I remember the time when we compared diesel and petrol cars. Remember when we said, well, if you do more than so-and-so 1,000 kilometers per year, it's better to have diesel. Even if it's more expensive when you buy it, it works out in the long term. Well, it's the same analysis. But to do that analysis, I need information. How many times have we been asked, how much does it cost to charge an electric vehicle? If you don't know, you can't do the analysis. So we're returning to the fact that we don't stop. We need to inform and raise awareness. And I also use this word, raising awareness, when Juan Diego said, if it doesn't benefit me, why am I going to get into this? Like for energy communities. Well, that's true. To make the change, the first thing the citizens need to know is, why am I going to get into this? With all my neighbors, or those of us living in a building, you know what happens with these communities. The first thing that's going to happen is that I'm going to have headaches, and it won't benefit my pocket. So why am I going to get into this? Well, this concern about climate change is among citizens, but relatively speaking. So concern about the economy at home is important, and that is transferred to the field of mobility. Earlier on, we talked about stability. I'm sure that Jose has more information, more details. The other day at a congress in Vitoria, they were saying Well, we know that due to the lack of regulatory stability in municipalities, you will be able to go into the municipality or not, depending on whether you use a combustion engine car. We're going to establish a low emissions area. In what municipalities? By what date? People don't really know what to buy. This is linked to what Jon just said. For each new vehicle sold, they're selling 1.7 used cars, they said the other day. And this is caused by the fact that people don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what to do. There's one more question at least, and I wanted to ask the speakers. Aitor Arceoga, it's a quick question on regulation for Jose. What calendar do you have at ANFAC to the approval of Euro 7, a new emissions regulation in Europe? Well, that's a tough question. Euro 7 is the new emissions regulation, which will replace the Euro 6D, which has just come into effect. In Europe, there's a big debate. It's a homogenized regulation at European level, and there's a lot of discussion because it's also linked to the Fit for 55 objectives. If the EU Commission considers that by 2035 there can't be any vehicles that's not purely electric, not even a hybrid, so the emissions regulations that they want has to be more aggressive. So there are people who say in that scenario, the first versions of the Euro City almost kills off the combustion vehicle because it leads to such significant investments for vehicles whose market will end in 10 years. Well, it won't be worth it. Those industrial cycles won't work. So the date is 2025. It's all being debated because the EU Commission, I don't think Fit for 55 has such widespread support. There are people who voted against it. So I think that they're working on it. My prediction is 2025, but I can't really give any details. We almost don't have any time, but I wanted to give you the chance. Well, I had a question for Fernando, if I can. Well, make it quick. I have this sensation with this context, with your experience in the ministry. It seems that we live in a society that is constantly scared about everything. We've gone through an economic crisis. It seems we're going to go through we're going to have a pandemic crisis. We're frightened again. And it has been 2 months since the pandemic is giving us a breather. And now everyone's worried about the energy crisis. Not so much in terms of saying now the price is here or there, but rather what's behind all this. So based on the variables that you talked about, it seemed that all this that's happening could have been forecast somehow. I don't know. So my question is that, could have this been forecast? Could we have acted sooner? It's very difficult. The terms that this has happened, I don't know if it could have been forecast a few months ago. The people knowing this could have covered themselves in another way with long-term prices. The dimension that this is taking on hadn't been planned. Certain increases were predictable. The EU Commission wants this to rise. It's a very intervened market. Part of the Fit for 55 policy is to remove emissions rights, so it will continue to rise. What hadn't been forecast was that it would be cheaper to emit carbon than gas, which is one of the things that emissions rights has, that the more contaminant energy, it should have been more expensive than non-contaminant energy. I read in the press that they were thinking about whether to build carbon sensors. I think the dimension we have couldn't have been predicted. Fernando, I want to add something key, and it's that Spain is where the crisis has emerged much more quickly and more radically than in any other country, due to the price for small consumers the price was transferred to people who knew the least about it, and they thought they were having a bargain with these subsidized price. But now this framework didn't have a risk coverage in the face of a rise in prices, and no other country have we seen such social alarm as here. This doesn't mean that there's no problem, but in Spain, the crisis, I would say, is the result of having had a price that meant the most vulnerable and those who knew the least about what it was all about, they were most directly affected by something that could have been predicted. So I would say it has more to do, in my opinion, with the previous government's decisions and for not having acknowledged the risk there was. I agree with you, and Monica mentioned this. People can't be thinking about the market. They can't know all the details about the energy market. It's a very complex issue, and it should have been avoided. It's true that tolerating everything that's happened is easier, but determining the domestic consumer price is very sophisticated. It's too sophisticated to understand properly, and the risks that the price volatility, this could have been minimized. We spent years asking for energy efficiency. The main tool for that is being aware of the price. It's a contradiction. Now we're saying, I'm not defending this at all, but these are the contradictions that we have to regulate, because on the one hand we're saying that the consumer has to be aware of the price, because the way to incentivize efficiency is that, and when they're aware of the price, we don't like it because the system is too sensitive. I put this on the table, but this is part of how difficult it is to regulate this transition. People couldn't understand anything at all. The idea of giving them signals and then letting them find their way. It's not the same as helping to create aggregation, which enables someone helping the consumer to decide when to consume, what electrical appliances to use, to store, storage. All this is happening now, and it has to be done, but we can't set prices where the possibility exists to respond hour by hour to what's happening in the spot market. This is the same as what they apply in automotive sector. You have to not only watch, but also the timing. Maybe the aggregators should have been there before the change in price. But if we don't do this, we have a problem. It's a bit like what I'm saying. We can increase objectives, but if the tools aren't there, maybe in 3 years' time we have a problem. So we need to have a revision. So how it's regulated is where we dedicate 5% of our analyses and where 95% of the results rely on. And it's an inconsistent system. Well, we learn through our mistakes. Let's have one last question each. I can imagine that the press will be talking about the Director General who's in the room next door, but supposing someone is interested in what we're saying and that there's a headline in the press in your name, I'd like to know what it would be. Europe needs coordination, route to remove barriers, and well-thought regulation. That's a very long headline. Europe. The need for coordination between countries is essential. I'd highlight as very positive measures such as the government, which is to create a governance table to deploy charging points. It doesn't cost money to coordinate. Well, first you said coordination in Europe. Well, this is the same. Let's take steps that work. If we aren't capable of sitting down at a table and discussing whether we're doing things properly or not, all the money in the world is left over. these kind of things don't cost money. It's a good way of regulating. You should talk to Javi to give you an idea of how to communicate this through a headline. We don't make many headlines, no. A headline would be, let's give town councils the opportunity to make an energy transition at citizen scale. You all have a directive communications to help you. Monica, I'm going to listen to you. My headline would be Smart Regulation, Tools and Opportunities. Very good. That's a nice headline. Well, thank you all very much for being with us.